we are finally ready to add a viewport manipulator class that will change this viewport region where it's looking at the data. So it's not going to move viewport 0. Viewport 0 is what we see on the screen. Viewport 1 is what's off screen. We'll write a class that manipulates that when we press the arrow keys. What's wrong here? Something is leaking off my edge of my screen here. Is it? Okay, so it's this. Hold on, sorry. Okay, that's better. And then we'll put this over here. And that's just weird. Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay. Sorry about that. So we got a lot of code in here. Well, it's not a lot. It's probably under 1,000 still. Yeah, but still under 1,000. We got enough code to where it's like, where am I going to put this? Like, where does it belong? Really, we shouldn't worry too much about that, but we should be a little bit conscientious of where we put the next chunk of code. I'm going to put it, like, over here. No, we're going to call it function viewports viewport 1 snapper. So viewport 1 snapper, and this is an object that, or a class that will take our custom global events and should it take the events or should it take one snapper? I'm going to say that this object, when we're like controlling it, it's going to take the global event object to, and then it'll read it and it'll see if the event has a key up, key down, like an arrow key. And if it's an arrow key, it'll do stuff with it. Yeah, okay, sure. So we need some functions here. We need a function that will update, or do we need a function that's going to just take the input? Function read input. We're going to call it read event, and then it'll take that global event object. Read event, it's going to mess around with the viewport. And, okay, yeah, so it's going to read the global event. And if global event dot key equals, and those constants, so let's put the strings on the left side so we don't do any accidental assignments. And we're going to have the, did I really make that? Hold on. We're going to have arrow up, right? And then actually, let's do this. So we're going to read an event, and if the global event contains any of these, then we'll do something about it. And we'll have a is that a little bit redundant? Let me think. Yeah, I don't. This might be a little bit overkill. We'll keep this for now, but I think this case might be a little overkill. So up, down, and then left and right. Right, and if those keys are pressed, we're going to move the viewport over the viewport that's going over the data. We're gonna. Oh, hold on. I need to start my timer. Okay, so the viewport that is looking over that data set, the tile map data set that's off screen, if we press some arrow keys, we want to translate that viewport. And we're going to move it in snapping increments. That's why I'm calling it viewport 1 snapper. And I'll just make a little comment here. VP1 and then SNA. So usually it's a bad idea to put like numbers in your variable names. But at some point you need to hard code some type of structure, right? Because if everything is completely flexible, then you just have spaghetti code. So it's kind of like a art figuring out what should be hard-coded and what shouldn't. I'm just going to always consider that viewport 0 is the screen viewport, and viewport 1 is the off-screen viewport that's looking over a data set. Okay. So with that said, let's make a variable over here that is var underscore for the private variables. And we also need... Nah, let's not do that. Okay, so over here, we'll say move... we'll say snap move viewport snap move, or we could say VP1 because we're going to move viewport 1. Yeah, I'll say snap move VP1, and then, or we could do this, snap move left, right, up, down, like that. Snap move VP1, and then left, right, like, we could write it like that. Okay, I kind of like that. Right, and then we'll have, if, and, you know, this is, let's say key equals global event dot key, like that. Then we don't have to write that as long. Okay, and if arrow left, and now we could do a switch statement, but switch statements really annoy me because depending on the language, they have slightly different rules. You know, in C, it has to be a constant expression, and then in other languages, it like always falls through unless you put a break, and then in other languages, it never falls through unless you put a pass statement. And then sometimes there'll be these weird restrictions on what's allowed in a switch statement. For example, I was using GameMaker, and it didn't let me have two statements that equated to the same thing. And that was kind of annoying. Now I get why you do that, because it's an error, but I had a whole bunch of synonymous statements. Or let me show you what I did. So I did something like this, like switch. Let's say we have switch key, right? And maybe we have like case arrow left like this. Or maybe we wanted to support something like this, case arrow left like this, right? And then maybe case arrow left, right? We want to support all of these, right? So what we would do is we would fall through all the way to here, and then we would do our logic right here. Okay. Now, of course, none of these statements are duplicates, but now imagine you're like in the middle of refactoring something, and you've decided you want to consolidate this, so you've decided to add another case statement, and it's going to be macro arrow left constant name, right? Something like that. And this macro arrow left constant name, it just happens to have the value of this, because this is the one you've decided on. And so now you're in the middle of refactoring everything, and oh, it's currently broken because, oh, these two statements are duplicate. Or there might be another reason for why you've decided that two of these statements are exactly the same. But you have this cluster of statements, and you want them all to, like, go to here, right? So that's the point of a case statement, is to allow you to fall through. But then the language is like, oh, screw you. You can't have two things that are duplicate because you're violating some rule. But the whole point of falling through, right, is to have statements that you kind of consider equal. Like this is the same as this is the same as this, and that's why they're all going to fall through to the same case. So if that's the case and you're allowed to do that kind of functionality, then something like this should also be allowed. I believe in JavaScript, you can get away with this. It's not a problem. But it just annoys me so much how different case statements can be in different languages. So I just do not want to use one. If you really want if it's really a situation where it's kind of like a lookup table kind of thing, you would want like a jump table, right? So you would want like we could do that for funsies. Why don't we do that for funsies? Let me think about it. Sure, why not? Why not? This is so we could do something like this. Var arrow up like this equals 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some case statement kind of functionality, but we're going to use an array. And this is how, like, if I wanted case-like logic, I would use what's called a jump table. So up, down, left, and right, right? And then we just set it to, like, this. So we got these, like, local constant values. And then what we would do is if key equals, you know, arrow up, then val equals, right? So if key equals arrow up, then the value equals arrow up, right? And then if we want that fall through kind of functionality, what we could do is if key equals arrow up like that, we could also do val equals this, like this, right? And that this would be like a fall through. Well, you might not get why that's a fall through just yet, but you'll see once I finish this. So we're gonna paste this a few times, and we'll paste this here. So what we're doing is we're gonna map these strings to, you know, sequential numbers, right? And then what we can do is we can just create a little jump table. So var jmp table. We don't want to call it yeah, we'll call it jump table, and it's an array. And the jump table and arrow up, arrow down, arrow left, arrow right, right? Now, this is what I'm doing right now. I think is way too complicated. But that's the whole point of, I'm not going to use a switch. Too complicated, too many varied rules on how it's done. So I'll just stick with if-else, unless there's absolutely a reason you need a switch statement. And some people will be like, no, use a switch because it kind of communicates some type of an intention. Okay, that's a good argument. But no. Okay. So, and we don't want to execute that. We just want to have function pointers. So we have this jump table, and then these different entries, right? So jump table 0, 1, 2, and 3 are all going to map to these different functions, right? And then what you do is you just go jump table, and instead of using the key up here, the key maps to a certain value, right? So we have var value. Let's put var val equals 0. So that way val up here. Actually, what we could do is we could do something like this. We could 0 minus 666. It's a negative number. And we can't access, well, maybe you can in JavaScript, but usually you can't put negative values as accessors. So we start off with the invalid selection, and then we look at which key was pressed, and then we're going to map that value to the arrow up code. Oop. We're going to map that value to the arrow up code, the down code, the left code, or the right code. And then we can use that value that corresponds to that key, and we can just call it. So in this jump table right down here, I'll just do this, and then we'll execute that function. So depending on which key was pressed, we'll call a snap move up, snap move down, snap move left, and snap move right. You know, but that's all kind of convoluted, and that's why. But this is how, if I really needed some type of switch statement logic, this is the way I would write it. I wouldn't actually write a switch. If I just need a switch is basically a jump table, so I would write it this way, right? And then if we need type of a synonym, right? Like, you know how a switch statement can have two cases that fall through to the same thing, right? We could get that logic like this. So, right? So this and this, two different strings, but they both map to the same value, and so it's kind of like a fall through because both of these values for the key are going to go to this jump snap move up, and then it's going to get called here through the jump table. Now, I've already written it, so maybe since it's already here, you know, I will, you know, before we move on, let's show you how, for completeness' sake, you really should keep it simple and just say, right, rather than all that mental indirection. If you do not need that mental indirection, then don't do it like that, right? Because, oops. Because this is all, for all that complexity you just saw, all we really need is this, right? So the key, if it's one of these, we're going to call one of these, right? So this is all you need, right? This is crazy, right? But if you need it, you need it. But we don't need it, so we don't need to get this fancy, so we shouldn't. Okay? We should just do it this way, okay? If statement, right? And we don't even have the if, right? We don't even need an if-else, right? Because, oh, sure, you're technically you're wasting cycles because, oh, it's going to do this comparison and this comparison and this comparison and this comparison, and oh, maybe you should just put an else, right? But why? Why? You're micro-optimizing if you do that. You're trying to save like a grain of rice in a waterfall is what you're doing if you try to optimize like that. So with that said of trying to keep things simple, we don't really need this guard. Up, down, left, right. Unless we really want something where we have some type of thing, you know, do thing that happens no matter which arrow key you press, right? And actually, we kind of technically do have something that we might want to happen no matter what arrow key we press, and that would be like to update the viewport, you know. So do we want those, or do we want that like updating graphic updating code? Do we want each one of these functions to trigger it, or do we want it to be triggered, you know, right here? So like update graphics, right? So no matter what key is pressed, if it's one of the valid movement keys, figure out which one it was, and then update the graphics. But then again, read event, maybe we only want read event to be even called. Maybe we only want read event to be called if it's actually one of these valid things to begin with, right? There's plenty of ways to do this. All I'm saying is switch statements are stupid. That's kind of what I'm saying. So we could do this, and of course we could write a switch, right? So switch key, right? And then we could do case arrow up like this, right? And then or is it case like that, or is it case? I think it's case like this. Sorry. I actually have a shortcut for a Java switch, so a JavaScript switch, so I can look at it really quick. JS switch, sure, the English one. Okay, so, right, and this, right, so here's a switch statement, and 1, 2, 3, and a default. So this has 4 choices. This has only 3 choices and then a default. And look how much more room this takes up. And then you got to remember to put the break statement every single time. Yeah, no. This is a lot easier. Now, if you do need an else, right? If you need a default statement, then you would have to put the else's at the end, right? Because then we're going to have our, default logic right here. And since all these options should be valid, I would expect never to get to this block of code. So what we could do is say throw expected one of 4 keys above. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll call this ECDL for expected, EDCL for EDCL, expected dead code line. And what I mean by that is I expect this code to never execute. I expect this code to be inaccessible by the way this was programmed. So unless there's an actual mistake in here, no matter what the state of the program is, there should be no possible way to get to here. The only possible way we can get to here is if we've screwed up the logic in here somehow. So this is, I believe this is called offensive coding. Like, I'm not even joking. It's a more extreme version of defensive coding. And I believe you can look that up on Wikipedia if you're curious. Okay, I'm okay with this read event code. That seems pretty good. And then like update graphics code. So we'll have another function called update graphics. And this will probably look at like our canvas adapter or whatever and make it redraw itself after moving around the viewports. Or we'll look for where that code is. Right now we'll just do like a console.log and a to-do update graphics. And I don't know. Okay. Timer's still running. I was just making sure. Update graphics, read event, right? It's going to read that keyword event, see which movement we want to do. And then we'll create these functions for the snap move. So function, oh, let me move over here. We can just take all these. Okay, function, snap move. And all we want to do is move the viewport, but we're not going to move the viewport directly. We're going to keep track of like these tile-based. So this viewport snapper is going to be controlling the viewport as if it was like snapped to like a tile-based grid. And so we want to keep track of some coordinates of where the viewport should be that are based on like these tile coordinates. So the first thing I want is a well, we have a private variables object, so let's make a little section here for private variables. And then at the bottom of this section, we'll do an object.seal on the private variables object. I'm going to record another video.